Hey y'all, this is David with Plantscape Solutions, and I'm going to do my best to attempt to mention every mod on this machine in one video. I'm sure I'm going to screw up and forget something, but I'm going to do my best. I'll start over here with my most recent mod, and I'm a horrible welder, so if you want to make like some welding memes, look at my shit and use it to make memes, and I'm sure I will make all your welding friends laugh their ass off. But I had to weld this, and it started to get a crack all the way around. Part of the problem is that the front side really didn't have any weld on it, because if it did, the bracket would hang up on the weld, so only part of it was welded. And I don't know what they use for weld on both sides, but I gotta tell you, when I took a grinder to it, it almost looked like they used crayons for welding rod, because this welding material was really soft. Where normally weld is really hard, harder than the actual steel usually. And it's, a pain to grind off, but it came off like a hot knife through butter. And then as we come over here, one of my mods that I did, because one of the problems is this throttle cable mount really probably should have been about a ½ inch down lower. So the problem you get originally is this throttle cable is actually kinked a little bit too much. So you tend to have guys that keep breaking the throttle cable with the end on the carburetor arm just keeps snapping off. So what I did to rectify part of that issue is I actually put some washer shims under there to lift up the cable just a little bit. Now a little bit made a pretty big difference. Then I actually shot a little WD-40 down inside the cable to help lube it. And then the other mod along these same lines is that nut right there on the adjuster arm that the cable for the throttle is attached to that you just can't see. It's actually set a little bit too tight. So if you back that off and you shim the cable, you will notice that it's been sitting here, so of course it's not going to work as perfectly as I'd like for a video, but basically that moves really easily. I never break any throttle cables. If you back off that arm too much, what's going to happen is you're going to get throttle creep, where it's not going to hold the position and the throttle is going to go up or down. So if you get that issue, tighten it back up a little bit. And here's just a little minor tweak I just made, because I had noticed that my handle was starting to wallow the hole a little bit. So I took a washer, shaved it down some, and put it under the C-clip just to make this handle have a little bit more, less slop basically. Other little tweaks I did, because I didn't like the way the linkages kind of flopped and slopped around. So on some of these linkages, I put washers under them to kind of tighten it up a little bit. And this engine plate on the older models had a big gap to it, but on the 250s, for some reason, they kind of goofed. And the OEM gap is half or less of what you see right now. So when you're changing a belt, because that's the only time you can do it, just take a big 6-inch handheld grinder or something like that and literally just massacre the end of this plate so you buffer it back a little bit to create the gap that you need. Because otherwise what happens is, if you're using any moist material, it'll clump under the roller. When it clumps, the actual roller size swells up, and it'll actually push the belt into the engine plate and make bite marks out of it. Then the other mod that I've got is just strictly a piece of angle iron that I attach to the top of the pillow bearings, and then I oblong the hole so I could actually move that piece of angle iron. So literally it is touching and rubbing on the steel roller and scrapes it, so it does not allow material to cling on the rear of the roller. Also, don't forget to occasionally, like every yard, or maybe even a couple of times during a big job, to actually clean out this spot if you add a roller scraper, because otherwise, little by little, material does build up in there. Then it can actually pack solid, and then you still can swell the roller. And if you see on the side, kind of bow with Earthkind Services in Dallas area, this was kind of his suggestion, although he actually made bigger mud flaps to go in the front of the tire to stop material from getting thrown onto the conveyor belt. But I actually used, this is actually the same type of material that the wiper seals and the hopper are made out of. So I just cut it and fit, because I definitely noticed when material is moist, it was actually getting thrown off the tires and onto the conveyor belts. And then the conveyor belt is constantly had issues with moist material getting on there, and actually causing some belt slip if you happen to be top dressing a lawn it was really moist, or was actually throwing like dirt from the job site onto the conveyor belt because it was sticking to the tires and flicking little bits of mud onto the actual conveyor belt. And so up here, you know, basically I've got my own wiper seals. So once again, that was actually Bo's idea to Earthkind Services. We kind of partnered up to come up with these better wiper seals. These particular seals in this machine have had over 500 cubic yards of material run through them, and they're like the day they were installed. They're perfect. No tearing issues like what you see with the OEM belts. Then if you look at the front, you can see the inner brackets for the front support that I had rigged up. That's strictly just Eco-Track stuff I had in my shop building. I didn't make a special shop trip to buy anything at Home Depot or anything. And then if you come along to the front, it's just nothing more than a longer strip of E-Track and then just a cable and an adjuster so I can get the height perfectly. And then not everybody's in my situation where they put their machine in a big trailer and having to run it up ramps. But I also took the ends of my bumper and actually cut them off and made it about an inch or so shorter on both ends, and then took a grinder and touched up the ends so nothing would be sharp. Now, other things to check for is sometimes the bolts on your hopper door might be a little bit too tight from the factory, so check those, because if they're too tight, it's actually going to bind up a little bit. And in my case, it definitely was binding up a little bit. And especially when you get a brand new machine, something to check for that mine had an issue with is when mine was brand new, the chain had no slop in it whatsoever. It needs to have some play in it. But when this machine was brand new, that chain was just ungodly tight. And the problem when your chain is super tight is that chain actually acts as a shock absorber, basically. So when you start and stop the machine, it's not sending a shock load instantly into your axle and ends up messing it up prematurely. So if you get by your machine, check the chain tension, because if it was like mine, there's a pretty good chance it is going to be over tightened. And then if you look over here, once again, I'm not a welder, so forgive the ugly welds, but the problem we had with the base of the handlebar after about season number 1 is we started getting, I think it was on the front side, crack. So I went out and spent $1,000 at Tractor Supply. I bought some welding supplies, got this C-channel, which is actually a pretty heavy duty little C-channel at Home Depot, ground out spots where the bolts go because I wanted to fit in there and have as much meat as possible, and basically just welded that. And I pretty much knew once I welded that that was going to create a tension point and the frame was going to be an issue. And sure enough, we started to get a crack on the frame. So I just took, as you can see it, a piece of angle iron, and I didn't even weld it in there. I just strictly added 2 bolts on both sides, put that piece of pretty beefy angle iron under there, and no more issues. That stress crack in the middle is kind of sandwiched where not having any issues. I also welded the spot behind the engine, because what I noticed originally was it's kind of more tack welded than an actual solid weld, which any legitimate welder, which I'm not, would have done when they built this machine. Excuse me, they would not have done just tiny welds. Every seam would have been welded from end to end. These little spacers you see under the engine, why those are there, in my opinion, is the engine drive belts. You don't buy them in certain lengths. So I think when they mounted up the engine to get the tension just right on the belts, they put spacers under the engine. The problem with that is, as you know, these engines, they vibrate, they're not counterbalanced. So instead of the entire engine being mounted on a plate where it's spreading out the vibration footprint, all the vibration now goes through these 4 spacers. So the problem we got was the engine plate started to get stress cracks in it. So I took some C-channel, welded it up onto the engine, and that pretty much put an instant stop to that problem. And if you look down there at my axle, if I can do this, you'll see on that side of the axle housing a black spacer. That was not there when I bought the machine. that is another must-do mod as well, because the problem is inside of that axle there's no actual bearings. There's simply a bronze wear bushing that acts as a bearing. And what kills these axles pretty much 100% of the time is that bushing will actually start to walk out of the axle. And once it walks out a little bit, that's all she wrote. The axle is going to start to bend and flex, and you're going to have issues. This is the original chain, but I actually have an O-ring chain that here shortly I'm going to swap to, and I think that's another must-have mod, because this is a dirty application machine, and having a non-O-ring chain where the sand gets inside of all those linkages, it just eats them up, and then your chain starts to, doesn't actually stretch due to pin wear, it stretches the fact that everything wears out. I think that pretty much covers most of my mods. See if I can get up without making too many god-awful noises. Also, don't forget to grease your hubs. Take your wheels off, put some grease on there. I'm dealing with several people now. They did not grease their wheels for extended periods of time, and now they're having to go to the dealer, and the dealer cost for one wheel and hub, you can't buy them separately, it's about $300. So if your axle goes out and you cannot get your wheels off, in addition to buying an axle, you're now stuck giving the dealer $600 for a new set of wheels and tires. And I can tell you right now, those tires themselves, you can buy them separately, are probably $30 a piece, and I'm sure that steel wheel, if you could get it at Harbor Freight or someplace like that, eBay, whatever, it's probably all of a $10 wheel. So instead of paying a fair price of $50 a wheel or $60, you're paying $300 each. So definitely do preventative maintenance and stay on top of those things. I think that pretty much covers. Oh yeah, don't ever use the tie downs that these machines come with, because that steel is just too thin, it'll bend. And the same goes for the tie down on the front right here. Do not ever use that. They pretty much set you up for failure by putting those tie downs on there, because the problem is with the front, you don't have any extra weight on that front bracket. It is just a horrible design where, I mean, they really should have had a structural engineer sign off on it, or at least maybe a extremely experienced fabricator that would have known the size steel that front bracket needs to be on. I actually had problems with it was starting to bend the frame in the front, because between the front bracket and the gearboxes, it's just way too much weight. It actually bolts to the top of the frame, you know, this portion of the frame, when it should have bolted to this portion of the frame. This is where the strength is in the frame. You know, the lips basically just help give the vertical part more structural rigidity, I guess you could say. But the lips themselves are the weakest part of the frame, but yet that is where they chose to bolt the actual gearboxes and dual disc to the front. And I think in a nutshell, I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but those are pretty much the mods that I have made to my machine. Even though I've had to tweak it quite a bit, I've run 500 cubic yards out of my machine this year and last year. Now, last year we did change an axle 3/4 the way through the season. Axle didn't go out this year, but I just went ahead and recently replaced it just to be safe. Some other tips when you do go to change a conveyor belt is, you can see that little tiny hole right there. It really doesn't take that much tension to pull the steel rod out of there to get, you know, the agitator out of the hopper. But what I found is you've got to buy a slide hammer, because without a slide hammer, it is just about impossible to get that rod out of there. So do yourself a favor, buy a slide hammer and make sure it has a hook attachment that you can put into that eye. And that is your trick for making what could be a horrible task that goes for hours and you waste days on one that's not that difficult at all. And when you put that back together again, same thing, grease the inside of that, because otherwise you're risking it just seizing up, especially if you're spreading anything with any nitrogen in it. You know, my material really doesn't have any nitrogen in it, So literally I never wash this machine, and I never have any problems whatsoever. If you got any questions, give me a shout. Recent tweak that I did as well was I replaced this wheel because it had started to wear and get some grooves in it, and the belts. I could not pull this machine forward or backwards. And personally, I'm not sure if there's really any difference. This machine came with the cog style belts, but I guess the last ones use just regular V belts, but I've yet to do a side-by-side test to see, is there any difference? Do the regular V belts slide better than the cog belts or not? I can tell you, do not use the Carlisle Timken belts on this machine, because even though they make great belts for everything else, for some reason on this machine, their cog teeth are a little bit more aggressive, and because of that, and the cogs being more aggressive on the inside, their belt is actually a little bit shorter, and I was catching a holy hell with this machine, just non-stop creeping. And once I switched back to a different brand of belts, and as far as all the other brands go, I don't think it really matters. Most all the brands are pretty good. Probably just stick with, name brand belts. I bought this machine, I think 4 years ago. I've put 1,000 cubic yards through it the last 2 years, and probably 350 to 400 the year before. So we do use this machine pretty heavily. It is pretty dependable once you make about 20 different mods to it. I would have to say, I think we're now up to like $8,000 or something for the cost on this. I think I paid closer to $7,000 when I bought this one. It definitely is an overpriced machine, being around $8,000, not having hydrostatic drive and other things. Because I can't imagine, I bet you could take this machine to China and probably make this thing for $1,500 or something like that. So if Earth and Turf does come out with their dual spinner, was it SP62, I'm probably definitely going to buy one and give it a shot and keep this machine and do a side-by-side shootout and see exactly how they compare. One of the pluses to this machine is it does weigh about 350 pounds, so it is easy to move around in your trailer. And the SP62 is pretty similar, where it's more like 375, but the SP100, that's a 700-pound machine. So even though they do have the dual spinners for the SP100, it's just, for me anyway, it's too big, too cumbersome. I find going backwards to spread material is not ideal. When you can go forward, you can get nooks and crannies a lot easier. And these machines are also shorter, so a little more nimble for getting between a house and a fence and places like that. And if you got any questions, give me a shout. And if you need axles, conveyor belts, or my wiper seals that are more heavy duty, I've yet to sell one set of wiper seals to a person twice. So literally we're probably going to be dead and gone, and the wiper seals are still going to be going strong. So hopefully this helps some people prevent issues before they become a problem and lead to downtime. Sorry, I just get over a cold, so my brain's a little on the foggy side.